In the shadowed corridors of Kensington Palace, where whispers carry more weight than words and tradition can crush a man's spirit, one security guard made a choice that would shake the very foundations of royal protocol. Marcus Thompson had served the crown for 12 years, but nothing had prepared him for the moment when he would have to choose between his career and protecting an innocent child from those who claimed to serve him. It was a Tuesday morning in March, when Marcus first noticed the bruises on 5-year-old Prince Louis's wrist, small, finger-shaped marks that shouldn't exist on any child, let alone a member of the royal family. What he discovered next would force him into a battle against centuries of palace tradition, powerful courtiers, and a system designed to silence anyone who dared to speak truth to power. This is the story of one man's refusal to look away, even when the entire weight of the British establishment pressed down upon him. It's a story about courage in the face of impossible odds, about protecting innocence in a world where image matters more than truth, and about the price of doing what's right when everyone around you insists you're wrong. Some fights are worth everything. This is one of them. Marcus Thompson adjusted his earpiece for the third time that morning as he walked through the pristine hallways of Kensington Palace. The marble floors reflected the early morning light streaming through the tall windows, creating patterns that danced across the walls lined with portraits of long-dead royals. He had been assigned to the Cambridge family's security detail for 6 months now, and every day still felt surreal. A kid from Manchester who had worked his way up through the Metropolitan Police, now protecting the future king and his family. The morning routine was always the same. Check the perimeter at dawn, review the day's schedule with the senior protection officer, and ensure all entry points were secure before the family began their day. Marcus prided himself on his attention to detail. It was this trait that had caught the eye of his superiors and earned him this prestigious assignment. But it was also this same attention to detail that would soon turn his world upside down. Prince Louis was an energetic 5-year-old who brought chaos and joy in equal measure to the otherwise ordered palace routine. Unlike his older siblings, George and Charlotte, who had learned to navigate royal protocol with increasing sophistication, Louis still possessed the uninhibited spirit of a child who didn't yet understand the weight of his birthright. Marcus had grown fond of the youngest prince's infectious laughter and endless questions about everything from why the guards wore such tall hats to whether the Queen's corgis could really understand English. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus was conducting his usual security sweep of the family's private wing when he heard raised voices coming from the nursery. This wasn't entirely unusual. Managing 3 children under the age of 10 required patience and firmness, and the Cambridge household staff were known for their professional competence. However, something in the tone made Marcus pause outside the door. The voice belonged to Mrs. Pemberton, the head nanny who had been with the family since Prince George's birth. She was a woman of impeccable credentials and stern demeanor, recommended by the palace staff office and approved personally by the Queen's private secretary. Her approach to child-rearing was old-fashioned and strict, emphasizing discipline and proper behavior above all else. The Cambridge parents, William and Catherine, trusted her completely and relied heavily on her expertise, especially during their increasingly busy schedule of royal duties. "You will sit properly and eat your breakfast without making a mess, Mrs. Bruce." Pemberton's voice carried clearly through the heavy wooden door. "Royal children do not behave like common street urchins. Your great-grandmother would be ashamed of such behavior." Marcus heard a small voice, unmistakably Prince Louis, respond with what sounded like a whimper. The child was known for being a picky eater, often preferring to play with his food rather than consume it. But this interaction seemed different. There was a tension in the air that made Marcus's protective instincts sharpen. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor was followed by a sharp crack and a small cry of pain. Marcus's training kicked in immediately. Any sound of distress from a principal, especially a child, required immediate investigation. He knocked firmly on the door and entered without waiting for permission. The scene before him was one that would be burned into his memory forever. Prince Louis sat at the small dining table, tears streaming down his face, cradling his left wrist against his chest. Mrs. Pemberton stood beside him, her face flushed with anger and what might have been embarrassment at being interrupted. The breakfast tray was on the floor, its contents scattered across the expensive Persian rug. "Is everything all right in here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but his eyes alert, taking in every detail of the scene. His gaze moved between the crying child and the clearly agitated nanny, noting the defensive posture Mrs. Pemberton had adopted. "Everything is perfectly fine," Mrs. Pemberton replied curtly, her voice regaining its usual authoritative tone. "The young prince had an accident while learning proper table manners. Children can be so clumsy, can't they?" But Marcus's attention was focused entirely on Prince Louis, who was still holding his wrist and sniffling quietly. The little boy's eyes met Marcus's with a look that seemed far too old and knowing for a 5-year-old. There was fear there, but also a pleading quality that made something cold settle in Marcus's stomach. "Let me take a look at that wrist, Your Highness," Marcus said gently, crouching down to the child's level. He had first aid training and had dealt with enough playground injuries during his community policing days to recognize when something was more serious than it appeared. Pemberton moved quickly to intercept. "That won't be necessary. I'm perfectly capable of handling minor bumps and scrapes. The prince needs to learn that tears won't solve every little problem." But Prince Louis, perhaps sensing an ally, extended his wrist toward Marcus with a trust that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. The moment Marcus saw the marks, his blood ran cold. The bruising was fresh but distinct. 4 small oval marks on one side of the thin wrist and a larger mark on the other side that clearly corresponded to an adult thumb. These were not the marks of an accidental fall or bump. These were grip marks, made by someone with adult-sized hands who had grabbed the child's wrist with significant force. Marcus had seen similar injuries during his time with the domestic violence unit of the Metropolitan Police. His mind immediately began cataloging the evidence. The pattern of the bruising, the defensive behavior of Mrs. Pemberton, the fear in the child's eyes, and the explanation that didn't match the physical evidence. "I think Prince Louis should be examined by the palace physician," Marcus said carefully, his voice neutral but firm. "Just to ensure there's no serious injury." Mrs. Pemberton's face went pale, then flushed red again. "I assure you that is completely unnecessary. The prince simply needs to be more careful. Perhaps if certain members of staff focused on their actual duties rather than interfering in matters that don't concern them, we would have fewer accidents." The threat in her words was barely veiled, but Marcus had faced down armed criminals in hostile crowds during his police career. An angry nanny, regardless of her connections to the royal household, didn't intimidate him. However, he was acutely aware that his position here was precarious. He was an outsider, a commoner who served at the pleasure of people whose families had been intertwined with royalty for generations. Prince Louis had stopped crying, but was watching the exchange between the two adults, with the intuitive understanding that children often possess about adult conflicts. He seemed to sense that something important was happening, even if he couldn't fully comprehend what it was. "I think it would be best if I informed the senior protection officer about the incident," Marcus said, pulling out his radio. "Standard protocol for any injury to a principal, regardless of how minor it might appear." "That is absolutely not necessary," Mrs. Pemberton snapped, abandoning any pretense of calm professionalism. "I am telling you that the child is fine. I have been caring for royal children longer than you have been protecting them. I know what requires medical attention and what does not." Marcus looked down at Prince Louis again, noting how the child instinctively pulled his injured wrist closer to his body when Mrs. Pemberton raised her voice. There were other subtle signs now that Marcus's trained eye was looking for them. The way Louis flinched slightly when Mrs. Pemberton moved too quickly, the carefully neutral expression he wore that seemed practiced for someone so young, and the general atmosphere of tension that permeated the room. "Your Highness," Marcus addressed Prince Louis directly, something that was technically a breach of protocol but felt necessary under the circumstances. "Can you tell me how you hurt your wrist?" The little boy's eyes darted nervously between Marcus and Mrs. Pemberton. For a moment it seemed like he might speak, but then his expression closed off and he shook his head silently. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something that looked disturbingly like resignation. Pemberton smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "As you can see, the prince confirms what I told you. He had an accident. Children his age are notorious for getting into scrapes and then forgetting exactly how it happened. Their imaginations often fill in the gaps with stories that bear little resemblance to reality." Marcus felt his jaw clench. The woman was not only covering up what had clearly happened, but she was also subtly discrediting any potential future testimony from the child. It was a manipulation tactic he had seen before in abuse cases, and it made him even more certain that his suspicions were correct. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted the tense standoff. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was making her morning rounds to check on the children before beginning her day of engagements. Her presence would change everything about this situation. But Marcus wasn't sure if it would be for better or worse. "Good morning, everyone," Catherine said brightly as she entered the room, her smile faltering as she took in the scene. "Is everything all right? I heard some commotion." Mrs. Pemberton immediately straightened and composed herself. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness. Prince Louis had a small tumble during breakfast. Nothing serious, but he was feeling a bit sorry for himself." Catherine's maternal instincts immediately kicked in as she moved toward her son. "Oh, sweetheart, what happened?" She knelt beside Prince Louis's chair and gently examined his wrist, her expression growing concerned as she saw the marks. "These look quite painful, darling," she said softly to Louis before looking up at Mrs. Pemberton with questioning eyes. "How exactly did this happen?" Marcus watched the interaction carefully, noting how Mrs. Pemberton's explanation became more elaborate as she repeated it. The story was evolving in real time, adding details that hadn't been mentioned before about how the chair had caught the prince's wrist when he fell. It was a classic sign of deception that Marcus had learned to recognize during his police training. Catherine, however, seemed to accept the explanation, trusting in the woman she had entrusted with her children's daily care. She kissed Prince Louis's forehead and assured him that she would have the palace physician take a look at his wrist later that morning. As the Princess of Wales prepared to leave for her first engagement of the day, Marcus faced a moment that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. He could let this incident pass, file a routine report, and continue with his duties. Mrs. Pemberton was a trusted member of the household staff, with impeccable references and years of service. Prince Louis was safe now, in the presence of his mother, and the injury would heal. But Marcus had spent too many years seeing what happened when good people chose to look the other way. He had seen the long-term damage that could be inflicted on children when adults failed to protect them, even when those adults had the best of intentions. He thought about his own childhood, about the teacher who had noticed the bruises on his classmate Sarah and had spoken up, probably saving her from years of continued abuse. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "I believe there may be some inconsistencies in the explanation for Prince Louis's injury that warrant further investigation." The room went deadly silent. Mrs. Pemberton's face went white, then red, as the implications of his words sank in. Catherine turned slowly to face him, surprise and confusion clear in her expression. "I'm sorry, what are you suggesting?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was not accustomed to having her staff or trusted advisors questioned. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that the next words out of his mouth would change everything. "I'm suggesting that Prince Louis's injuries are consistent with grip marks, not with an accidental fall. I believe he may have been grabbed forcefully by an adult, and I think this incident needs to be properly documented and investigated." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her face cycling through expressions of shock, outrage, and calculation. Catherine's expression hardened as she processed what Marcus was implying about someone she had trusted with her children for years. "That is an absolutely outrageous suggestion," Mrs. Pemberton finally managed to sputter. "I have devoted my entire career to the care and protection of children. The idea that I would harm Prince Louis is not only offensive, but completely unfounded." Marcus kept his expression neutral, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Either he would be vindicated in his suspicions, or his career would be over before the day was through. But as he looked at Prince Louis, still cradling his injured wrist and watching the adult drama unfold around him, Marcus knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The battle lines had been drawn, and there would be no backing down from either side. The next hour felt like the longest of Marcus's life. Catherine had immediately called for the palace physician Dr. Socia, Elizabeth Hayes, who arrived within minutes carrying her traditional black medical bag. The atmosphere in the nursery had become thick with tension as the various parties positioned themselves for what was clearly going to be a battle of credibility and influence. Dr. Hayes was a woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been the royal family's personal physician for over 15 years and had earned their complete trust through her discretion and competence. As she examined Prince Louis's wrist with gentle but thorough precision, her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. "The bruising pattern is quite distinct," Dr. Hayes murmured, more to herself than to the assembled group. She took several photographs with a medical camera, documenting the marks from multiple angles with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen too much to be easily shocked. Mrs. Pemberton stood rigidly beside Catherine, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. She had maintained her story consistently, but Marcus noticed small details that suggested her growing anxiety. The way she kept touching her throat when she spoke, the slight tremor in her voice when she repeated her explanation for the third time, and the careful way she avoided making direct eye contact with Dr. Hayes during the examination. "Your Highness," Dr. Hayes finally said, addressing Catherine directly, "I need to speak with you privately about my findings." Catherine nodded, casting a worried glance at her son, who had been remarkably quiet throughout the entire ordeal. Prince Louis seemed to understand that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't fully grasp the implications. His usual chatter and energy had been replaced by an unusual stillness that was heartbreaking to witness. Marcus remained in the room with Mrs. Grey, Pemberton and Prince Louis, while Catherine and Dr. Hayes stepped into the adjoining sitting room. Through the partially open door, he could hear the low murmur of serious conversation, but the words were indistinct. "Mrs. Book." Pemberton paced nervously near the windows, occasionally shooting venomous glances in Marcus's direction. "You have no idea what you've started," she finally hissed in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the next room. "Do you think you can just waltz in here and destroy someone's life based on your paranoid fantasies? I have served this family faithfully for years. I love these children as if they were my own." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was watching Prince Louis, who had moved to a corner of the room where his favorite toy cars were arranged in neat rows. The little boy was playing quietly, but Marcus noticed how he kept his injured wrist carefully protected and how he glanced nervously toward Mrs. Pemberton whenever she raised her voice. "If you truly love these children," Marcus said quietly, "then you would want them to be safe and protected, regardless of who that protection comes from or who it might implicate." Pemberton's face flushed with anger. "How dare you lecture me about these children? You've known them for 6 months. I've been caring for Prince George since he was an infant. I've been entrusted with the most precious responsibilities in the realm. The Princess of Wales relies on me completely." The conversation in the adjoining room had grown more intense. Marcus could hear Catherine's voice rising slightly, though still maintaining the controlled tone that years of royal training had instilled in her. Dr. Hayes's responses were calm but firm, the voice of a medical professional presenting unwelcome facts to someone who desperately didn't want to hear them. When Catherine returned to the nursery 15 minutes later, her expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. She moved immediately to Prince Louis, gathering him into her arms with a protective fierceness that confirmed Marcus's worst fears about what Dr. Hayes had told her. "Mrs. Pemberton," Catherine said, her voice carrying a cold authority that Marcus had never heard from her before, "I'm going to need you to gather your personal belongings. Mr. O. Davies from Human Resources will be here shortly to discuss the terms of your immediate departure from this position." The words hit Mrs. Pemberton like physical blows. She staggered backward slightly, her face going through a rapid series of expressions: shock, denial, anger, and finally, desperate calculation. "Your Royal Highness, surely you don't believe these wild accusations. I have given my entire career to your family. Ask anyone who has worked with me. Check my references. Speak to the Queen's private secretary who personally recommended me for this position." Catherine's expression didn't soften. "Dr. Hayes has confirmed that Louis's injuries are consistent with being grabbed forcefully by an adult hand. The pattern and severity of the bruising cannot be explained by an accidental fall. Combined with the inconsistencies in your explanation and other factors, I have no choice but to take immediate action to protect my children." Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane. One jumped-up security guard makes a wild accusation and suddenly I'm being treated like a criminal? Do you have any idea what this will do to my reputation, my career? I'll never work in childcare again based on these lies. If the allegations prove to be unfounded, then I'm sure your reputation will recover, Catherine replied with icy politeness. However, my first and only priority is the safety and well-being of my children. I will not take any risks when it comes to their protection. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and dread washing over him. Relief that Prince Louis would be protected from further harm, but dread about what this would mean for his own future. He had essentially forced the hand of the Princess of Wales, compelling her to take action against someone she had trusted implicitly. Even if he had been right about Mrs. Pemberton, there would be consequences for the way he had handled the situation. As if reading his thoughts, Catherine turned to him with an expression that was impossible to interpret. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to come with me. We need to discuss your role in today's events." They walked in silence through the corridors of Kensington Palace toward Catherine's private office. Marcus had never been in this part of the royal residence before, and under different circumstances, he might have been impressed by the elegant furnishings and priceless artwork that lined the walls. Instead, his mind was focused on the conversation that was about to take place, and its potential ramifications for his career and future. Catherine's office was smaller and more intimate than Marcus had expected. Instead of the formal grandeur he had imagined, it was decorated with family photographs, children's artwork, and personal touches that made it feel like an actual workspace rather than a royal showroom. Catherine gestured for him to sit in one of the comfortable chairs facing her desk while she poured 2 cups of tea from a service that had been waiting for them. "Tell me exactly what you observed this morning," Catherine said without preamble. "I want every detail, from the moment you first became aware that something was wrong until the moment you made your accusation." Marcus took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the morning, being careful to separate his observations from his interpretations. He described the voices he had heard, the scene he had discovered when he entered the nursery, the nature of Prince Louis's injuries, and Mrs. Pemberton's reactions to his questions. He also mentioned the subtle behavioral signs he had noticed in Prince Louis that suggested a pattern of intimidation or abuse. Catherine listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a pad of paper. Her expression remained carefully controlled, but Marcus could see the pain in her eyes as she processed the implications of what he was telling her. As a mother, she was clearly devastated by the possibility that someone she had trusted had been hurting her child. As a member of the royal family, she was undoubtedly calculating the potential public relations nightmare that this situation could become. "Dr. Hayes confirmed your assessment of Louis's injuries," Catherine said when Marcus had finished his account. She also mentioned that when she examined him more thoroughly, she found evidence of previous minor injuries that had healed, small bruises on his upper arms that were consistent with being grabbed or shaken, and some scratches that appeared to be defensive wounds. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The situation was even worse than he had initially suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident of lost temper. It was a pattern of abuse that had been going on for some time. The fact that no one had noticed before made him feel sick with guilt, even though he had only been assigned to the family's detail recently. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," Catherine continued. "Did you have any previous suspicions about Mrs. Pemberton's treatment of the children? Any concerns that you didn't voice?" Marcus thought carefully about the question. Looking back over the past 6 months, there had been small things that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now took on a more sinister cast. Prince Louis's occasional reluctance to return to the nursery after family time. The way he sometimes flinched when Mrs. Pemberton approached him too quickly. The careful way all 3 children behaved when she was present, as if they were walking on eggshells. There were subtle things, Marcus admitted. Behaviors that seemed odd but that I attributed to normal family dynamics or the pressures of royal life. Prince Louis seemed more subdued when Mrs. Pemberton was around, but I thought that was just the difference between family time and structured learning time. I regret not paying closer attention to those signs. Catherine nodded slowly. We're all guilty of that. Mrs. Pemberton came with impeccable references and years of experience. She seemed like the perfect choice to help us manage the children's increasingly complex schedules. It never occurred to me that someone in her position might pose a threat to them. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Prince William entered, his face grim with the news he had obviously already received. Marcus immediately stood up, recognizing that his presence in this family crisis was becoming increasingly awkward. Please sit down, Mr. Thompson, William said, his voice carrying both authority and what might have been gratitude. I understand that we owe you a debt for protecting our son today. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise, knowing that he had simply done what any decent person should do when confronted with evidence of child abuse. I was just doing my job, Your Royal Highness. Protecting the welfare of the principals is my primary responsibility. William and Catherine exchanged a look that carried volumes of unspoken communication. They were clearly dealing with multiple layers of crisis: the immediate concern for their son's safety, the broader implications for their household staff, and the potential public relations disaster if news of this incident became public. We need to discuss how to handle this situation going forward, William said, settling into the chair beside his wife. Clearly, we need to conduct a thorough investigation to determine the full extent of what has been happening and whether any other staff members were aware of or complicit in Mrs. Pemberton's behavior. Catherine pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. I'm going to call Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison. She handles sensitive cases for Scotland Yard and has worked with the palace before on security matters. If we're going to investigate this properly, we need someone with experience in child protection cases. Marcus felt a chill of recognition at the name. Detective Inspector Morrison had been his supervisor during his time with the Domestic Violence Unit of the Metropolitan Police. She was a tough, uncompromising investigator who had built her reputation on her ability to handle high-profile cases with both thoroughness and discretion. If she was being brought in, it meant that this situation was being treated with the utmost seriousness. There's something else we need to consider, William said gravely. If Mrs. Sidemight Pemberton has been abusing Louis, and if there's evidence of a pattern of behavior, she could face criminal charges. This isn't just a matter of dismissing an unsatisfactory employee, it's a potential criminal investigation involving the assault of a minor who happens to be fifth in line to the throne. The weight of the situation was becoming clearer by the moment. Marcus had uncovered not just a case of child abuse, but a scandal that could rock the royal family and dominate headlines around the world. The thought of Prince Louis being subjected to that level of public scrutiny made him feel sick. Catherine must have noticed his expression because she leaned forward slightly. Mr. Thompson, I need you to understand that everything we've discussed today is absolutely confidential. The protection of my children's privacy and well-being is paramount. But that doesn't mean we're going to sweep this under the rug or avoid taking appropriate action. I understand completely, Your Royal Highness, Marcus replied. My only concern is ensuring that Prince Louis and his siblings are safe and that anyone responsible for harming them faces appropriate consequences. William nodded approvingly. That's exactly the attitude we need from our security team. However, I need to be frank with you about the challenges ahead. Mrs. Pemberton has connections throughout the palace hierarchy. She's worked for several prominent families and has built relationships with powerful people who may not want to see her career destroyed based on what they might characterize as an overzealous security guard's misinterpretation of an accident. Marcus felt his jaw clench at the implication. Are you saying that there will be pressure to minimize or cover up what happened? Catherine and William exchanged another meaningful look before Catherine answered. What we're saying is that there are people within the palace structure who prioritize institutional reputation over individual accountability. We're committed to doing the right thing, but we need to be prepared for resistance from some quarters. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison herself, arriving with characteristic efficiency less than an hour after being contacted. Marcus felt a surge of conflicting emotions at seeing his former supervisor. Relief at having someone he trusted involved in the investigation, but also apprehension about how his role in the case might be perceived. Your Royal Highnesses, Detective Inspector Morrison said with a formal nod before her eyes found Marcus. Constable Thompson, I should have known you'd be in the middle of something like this. You always did have a nose for trouble. Despite the gravity of the situation, Marcus felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Detective Inspector Morrison's dry sense of humor and uncompromising integrity had made her one of the most respected officers in the Metropolitan Police. If anyone could navigate the political complexities of investigating abuse within the royal household, it was her. Let's get started, she said, pulling out a digital recorder and setting it on Catherine's desk. I need to hear everything from the beginning, and I need to examine the victim and the crime scene while the evidence is still fresh. But first, I need everyone to understand that this is now a formal criminal investigation. That means certain protocols must be followed, regardless of anyone's position or preferences. As Detective Inspector Morrison began her methodical questioning, Marcus realized that his decision to speak up that morning had set in motion a chain of events that would test everyone involved. The easy part was over. Now came the real battle. Fighting a system that was designed to protect itself, even at the cost of protecting those who needed it most. Within 48 hours of Detective Inspector Morrison beginning her formal investigation, Marcus began to understand exactly what Prince William had meant about resistance from within the palace structure. The pressure started subtly, as these things always do in institutions built on tradition and hierarchy. The first sign came during his regular briefing with Chief Protection Officer James Hartwell, a man who had spent 30 years climbing through the ranks of royal security. Hartwell was old-school establishment, someone who understood that discretion and loyalty were more valuable currencies than truth or justice when it came to protecting the crown's interests. "Thompson," Hartwell said without looking up from the papers scattered across his desk, "I've been reviewing your service record since joining the Royal Protection Detail. Generally satisfactory, though some of your supervisors have noted a tendency towards independence that doesn't always align with our operational requirements." Marcus remained standing at attention, recognizing the opening moves of what was clearly going to be a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine his credibility. "Sir, could you be more specific about these concerns?" Hartwell finally looked up, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. "Independence in this context means making decisions without proper consultation with the chain of command, interpreting situations through your own lens rather than following established protocols, yesterday's incident being a prime example." Implication was clear, but Marcus refused to be intimidated. "Sir, are you suggesting that I should have ignored evidence of child abuse because it might create complications for the household management? I'm suggesting that you might have misinterpreted what you observed because you lack the experience and context to understand the complexities of managing royal children," Hartwell replied smoothly. "Mrs. Pemberton has an impeccable record spanning over a decade. She's worked with some of the most prominent families in the country. The idea that she would suddenly start abusing children is problematic." Marcus felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "The physical evidence of Prince Louis's injuries speaks for itself. Dr. Hayes confirmed that the bruising pattern was consistent with forceful gripping by an adult hand. That's not a matter of interpretation." Hartwell leaned back in his chair with the air of someone who held all the cards. "Dr. Hayes is a competent physician, but she's not a forensic specialist. Bruising patterns can be misleading, especially on young children, who are naturally active and prone to accidents. I've spoken with several colleagues who have experience with these matters, and they agree that jumping to conclusions about abuse based on limited physical evidence is dangerous and irresponsible." Marcus realized that the fix was already in. Hartwell had clearly spent the past day consulting with people who would support the narrative he wanted to construct, that Marcus was an overzealous security guard who had misinterpreted an innocent accident and caused unnecessary drama for a respected member of the household staff. "Furthermore," Hartwell continued, shuffling through a stack of documents, "I've received some concerning reports about your general conduct since joining this detail. Questions about your fitness for this level of responsibility have been raised by multiple sources." "What kind of reports?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew what was coming. Hartwell pulled out a folder and opened it with theatrical precision. "Mrs. Pemberton has submitted a formal complaint alleging that you've been conducting unauthorized surveillance of her activities, making her feel uncomfortable and paranoid in her workplace. She claims you've been asking inappropriate questions about her methods and undermining her authority with the children." Marcus felt his stomach drop. It was a masterful counterattack, turning his legitimate security concerns into evidence of unprofessional behavior. By filing a complaint before the investigation had concluded, Mrs. Pemberton and her allies were attempting to establish an alternative narrative that portrayed Marcus as the problem rather than the solution. "Sir, those allegations are completely false. I have never conducted unauthorized surveillance of any household staff member. My only interactions with Mrs. Pemberton have been in the course of my normal security duties." Hartwell nodded with mock sympathy. "I'm sure that's how you see it, Thompson. Unfortunately, perception and reality don't always align, especially in high-pressure environments like this. 1. The stress of protecting such high-profile principals can sometimes lead to heightened paranoia and misinterpretation of normal behaviors. The door opened, and Marcus turned to see Sir Christopher Hartwell, the Queen's private secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the palace hierarchy, entering the room. Sir Christopher was a man who had devoted his entire career to protecting the institution of the monarchy, often at the expense of the individuals within it. "Ah, Thompson," Sir Christopher said with the kind of cold politeness that the British upper class had perfected over centuries. "I understand you've caused quite a stir over the past few days. It's about history, and it can demonstrate it respectively. And so whatever their worries after is it's amazing, man. It can diminish the trajectory of his entire future. Our sisters are wildly strong about deciding, and they eventually decided that there is no matter where they science is question. I believe that falls within my duties as a protection officer." Sir Christopher smiled, but it was the predatory smile of a shark who had detected blood in the water. "Indeed, your dedication to duty is admirable. However, there's a difference between dedication and zealotry. The palace functions on trust and discretion. When that trust is violated, it creates problems that extend far beyond the immediate situation." "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by violated trust, sir." Sir Christopher moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that conveyed both authority and disappointment. "Mrs. Pemberton has served the royal family faithfully for over a decade. She has cared for multiple generations of royal children and has earned the trust of some of the most discerning parents in the country. Your accusations have not only damaged her reputation irreparably, but they've also called into question the judgment of their royal highnesses in selecting their household staff." Marcus felt the full weight of the establishment's displeasure settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Mrs. Pemberton anymore. It was about protecting the royal family from the embarrassment of having hired someone who abused their children. The institution's reputation mattered more than justice for a 5-year-old boy. "Furthermore," Sir Christopher continued, turning back to face Marcus, "Detective Inspector Morrison's investigation has raised some eyebrows at the highest levels. The idea that we need outside police interference in internal palace matters suggests a breakdown in our own security and management protocols. Some people are questioning whether that breakdown originated with failures in our protection detail." The threat was becoming clearer. Marcus was being positioned as the scapegoat for a systemic failure that allowed Mrs. Pemberton to abuse Prince Louis undetected. By casting doubt on his competence and judgment, they could discredit his testimony and minimize the severity of the abuse allegations. Chief Protection Officer Hartwell cleared his throat. "Thompson, I think it would be in everyone's best interest if you took some time to consider whether this position is really the right fit for your particular temperament. The Royal Protection Detail requires a specific type of person, someone who can work within established hierarchies and understand the broader implications of their actions." Marcus looked between the two men, understanding that he was being offered a face-saving exit strategy. He could resign quietly, probably with a decent reference, and find another position in law enforcement or private security. All he had to do was walk away and let the palace handle the situation in whatever way they deemed appropriate. The problem was that he couldn't stop thinking about Prince Louis's injured wrist and the fear in the little boy's eyes. He couldn't stop remembering how the child had flinched when Mrs. Pemberton raised her voice, or how he had instinctively protected his injured arm. Marcus had seen too many cases where good people chose the easy path and children continued to suffer as a result. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I believe I'll stay in my current position. I have a duty to protect the royal family, and I intend to fulfill that duty regardless of any personal consequences." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sir Christopher's expression hardened into something that was far less polite and far more dangerous. "That's unfortunate, Thompson. I was hoping we could resolve this matter with minimal disruption to all parties involved. However, if you insist on pursuing this course of action, you should understand that there will be consequences. Your service record will be scrutinized very carefully. Your fitness for this position will be questioned, and ultimately, your continued employment will depend on your ability to demonstrate that you can function effectively within our organizational structure." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. This was how the system protected itself. not through outright threats or obvious intimidation, but through bureaucratic pressure and institutional weight. They would make his life miserable until he chose to leave on his own, allowing them to avoid the appearance of retaliating against a whistleblower. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the door. Chief Protection Officer Hartwell's assistant entered with an apologetic expression. "Excuse me, sir, but Detective Inspector Morrison is here requesting an immediate meeting with Mr. Thompson. She says it's urgent and relates to the ongoing investigation." Sir Christopher and Chief Protection Officer Hartwell exchanged a look that suggested this development was not entirely welcome. They had clearly hoped to resolve the Marcus problem before Detective Inspector Morrison made too much progress in her investigation. "Send her in," Sir Christopher said after a moment's hesitation. Detective Inspector Morrison entered the room with her characteristic no-nonsense demeanor. She was a woman in her early 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the scene before her. She nodded politely to Sir Christopher and Chief Protection Officer Hartwell before focusing her attention on Marcus. "Thompson, I need to speak with you privately about some new developments in our investigation. There have been some significant findings that require immediate discussion." Sir Christopher stepped forward slightly. "Detective Inspector, I hope you understand that Mr. Thompson is currently undergoing a performance review related to his handling of the incident in question. His availability for further questioning may be limited." Detective Inspector Morrison's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the steel in her eyes. "Sir Christopher, this is a formal criminal investigation into the alleged abuse of a minor. Mr. Thompson is a key witness whose testimony is crucial to the case. Any attempt to interfere with his participation in this investigation would be inadvisable." The room fell silent as the two representatives of different power structures faced off. Sir Christopher represented the old way of doing things, where problems were managed internally and public scandal was avoided at all costs. Detective Inspector Morrison represented the rule of law, where crimes were investigated thoroughly regardless of the social status of those involved. "Of course," Sir Christopher said finally, his tone suggesting anything but agreement. "The palace is committed to cooperating fully with any legitimate investigation. However, I trust that you understand the sensitive nature of these allegations and the importance of maintaining appropriate discretion throughout the process." Detective Inspector Morrison smiled coldly. "Discretion is certainly important, sir. However, my primary concern is ensuring that justice is served and that any children who may have been harmed are protected from further abuse. I'm sure you share those priorities." Marcus followed Detective Inspector Morrison out of the office, feeling the weight of hostile stares on his back. He understood that by walking out that door with her, he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. The palace establishment had made it clear that they viewed him as a threat to be neutralized rather than an asset to be protected. As they walked through the corridors toward a more secure location where they could speak privately, Detective Inspector Morrison leaned closer to him. "Marcus, I need you to understand what you're up against here. These people have been protecting their interests for centuries, and they're very good at it. They'll use every tool at their disposal to discredit you and minimize this case. The only way we're going to get justice for Prince Louis is if you're prepared to fight them every step of the way." Marcus nodded grimly. "What did you find in your investigation?" Detective Inspector Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "We found evidence that suggests this pattern of abuse may have been going on for months, possibly longer. And we found indications that other staff members may have been aware of what was happening but chose not to report it. This case is bigger than just one abusive nanny, Marcus. It's about a system that failed to protect a vulnerable child." As they reached the secure interview room, Marcus realized that his decision to speak up about Prince Louis's injuries had uncovered something much more serious than he had initially suspected. The real battle was just beginning, and the forces arrayed against him were more powerful than he had ever imagined. But looking back on the fear in Prince Louis's eyes, he knew that backing down was not an option. The evidence that Detective Inspector Morrison had uncovered during her investigation was damning. 3 weeks into the formal inquiry, she had compiled a file that painted a picture of systematic abuse and willful blindness that reached far beyond Mrs. Pemberton's direct actions. Marcus sat in the secure interview room, reviewing documents that made his stomach churn with anger and disgust. "Look at this," Detective Inspector Morrison said, sliding a medical report across the table. "Dr. Hayes conducted a comprehensive examination of Prince Louis under controlled conditions. She found evidence of at least 6 separate incidents of physical abuse over the past 4 months. Healed bruises, scratches, and what appears to be a hairline fracture in his left pinky finger that was never properly treated. Marcus studied the photographs attached to the medical report, each one documenting injuries that should never have existed on any child, let alone one who was supposedly under the protection of trained child care professionals. The clinical language of the medical terminology couldn't hide the reality of what had been done to an innocent 5-year-old boy. "How did no one notice this before?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Detective Inspector Morrison pulled out another folder. "That's where this gets really ugly. I interviewed the other household staff members separately, and several of them admitted to having suspicions about Mrs. Pemberton's treatment of the children. The head housekeeper, Maria Santos, said she noticed that Prince Louis seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn whenever Mrs. Pemberton was around. The assistant gardener mentioned seeing the nanny grabbing Prince Louis roughly on at least 2 occasions. Marcus felt his anger building. And none of them reported their concerns? They were all told by their supervisors that Mrs. Pemberton was a highly qualified professional whose methods might seem strict but were approved by the family. When staff members expressed concerns, they were essentially told to mind their own business and focus on their assigned duties. Detective Inspector Morrison opened another file that contained transcripts of interviews with palace staff. The pattern that emerged was one of institutional protection for Mrs. Pemberton and systematic discouragement of any questioning of her methods. Staff members who raised concerns were transferred to different duties or had their employment terminated for unrelated reasons. But the most damning evidence, Detective Inspector Morrison continued, comes from the palace's own internal communication records. I was able to obtain emails and memoranda through a court order, and they show that certain members of the senior household management were aware of complaints about Mrs. Pemberton's behavior as early as 6 months ago. Marcus felt his blood run cold. "You're telling me that people in positions of authority knew that Prince Louis was being abused and chose to do nothing about it?" Detective Inspector Morrison nodded grimly. Not only did they do nothing, but they actively worked to suppress information and protect Mrs. Pemberton from scrutiny. There's an email thread between Chief Protection Officer Hartwell and Sir Christopher discussing managing staff concerns about the nanny situation and ensuring that unfounded rumors don't damage a valued employee's reputation. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just a case of one abusive individual who had slipped through the system's safeguards. This was a systematic cover-up that had prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. Marcus realized that his decision to speak up had exposed a rot that went to the very heart of the palace's power structure. "There's more," Detective Inspector Morrison said, pulling out a digital audio recorder. "One of the junior staff members, Emily Watson, came forward yesterday with information that changes everything. She secretly recorded a conversation where Mrs. Pemberton threatened her job if she ever mentioned what she had witnessed in the nursery." Detective Inspector Morrison played the recording, and Marcus listened in horror as Mrs. Pemberton's voice, clear and unmistakable, described how she would destroy Emily's career and ensure that she never worked in child care again if she spoke about the discipline methods that were necessary to control spoiled royal brats. The callousness in her tone was chilling, but what was even worse was the calculated way she used her institutional power to silence potential witnesses. This recording provides clear evidence of witness intimidation and conspiracy to cover up child abuse, Detective Inspector Morrison explained. Combined with the medical evidence and the testimony from multiple witnesses, we have more than enough to proceed with formal criminal charges against Mrs. Pemberton and potentially against some of the senior staff who enabled her behavior. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and revulsion. He had been right about what he had witnessed, but the validation came at the cost of confirming that Prince Louis had suffered far more abuse than anyone had initially realized. The thought of what the little boy had endured while the adults around him either participated in or ignored his suffering was almost unbearable. What about the family? How are Prince William and Princess Catherine handling this? Detective Inspector Morrison's expression softened slightly. As you might imagine, they're devastated. The guilt they're feeling for having trusted someone who was harming their son is overwhelming. Princess Catherine has been particularly affected. She's blaming herself for not seeing the signs and for not protecting Louis from someone she brought into their home. Marcus could only imagine the emotional turmoil the royal couple was experiencing. As parents, they would be dealing with the trauma of knowing their child had been hurt under their own roof by someone they had trusted completely. As public figures, they would also be grappling with the potential scandal and media attention that a criminal prosecution would bring. However, Detective Inspector Morrison continued. They've been absolutely clear that they want justice for their son, regardless of the personal or political consequences. Prince William specifically told me that protecting Louis and ensuring this never happens to another child is more important than protecting the palace's reputation. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Detective Inspector Morrison's assistant entered with an urgent expression. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem. Mrs. Pemberton's legal team has filed for an emergency injunction to halt the investigation. They're claiming that evidence was obtained improperly and that their client's rights have been violated. The hearing is scheduled for this afternoon." Detective Inspector Morrison cursed under her breath. Of course they did. Mrs. Pemberton's family has connections to some very expensive legal talent. They're not going to go down without a fight. Marcus felt a familiar sense of dread. This was exactly the kind of legal maneuvering that had derailed other cases he had been involved in during his police career. Wealthy defendants with high-powered attorneys often managed to escape justice through technical challenges and procedural delays that exhausted the resources of prosecutors and discouraged witnesses from continuing to cooperate. There's something else. Detective Inspector Morrison's assistant continued. Sir Christopher has requested an immediate meeting with the investigation team. He's claiming that the palace has new information that might affect the case. Detective Inspector Morrison and Marcus exchanged a knowing look. This was clearly an attempt by the palace hierarchy to regain control of the narrative and potentially derail the criminal prosecution before it could proceed to trial. An hour later, they found themselves back in Sir Christopher's office. But this time, the power dynamic had shifted significantly. Detective Inspector Morrison's investigation had uncovered evidence that implicated several senior palace officials in covering up child abuse, and the threat of criminal charges had changed the nature of the conversation entirely. Sir Christopher appeared significantly less composed than he had during their previous meeting. His usual air of unassailable authority had been replaced by the careful wariness of someone who understood that his own position might be in jeopardy. Detective Inspector Morrison, Sir Christopher began, I've called this meeting because I believe there may be some misunderstandings about the palace's handling of this situation that need to be clarified. Detective Inspector Morrison remained standing, projecting an authority that made it clear she was now in control of the situation. Sir Christopher, if you have information relevant to our investigation, I'm prepared to hear it. However, I should inform you that anything you say may be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. Sir Christopher's face went pale at the implication that he might himself be a target of the investigation. I want to make it absolutely clear that the palace's primary concern has always been the welfare of the royal children. Any suggestion that we would knowingly permit or cover up abuse is absolutely false. Detective Inspector Morrison pulled out a folder containing the email exchanges that her investigation had uncovered. Then perhaps you can explain these communications between yourself and Chief Protection Officer Hartwell regarding managing the nanny situation and ensuring that unfounded rumors didn't damage Mrs. Pemberton's reputation. Sir Christopher examined the documents, his composure cracking further as he realized the implications of his own written words. Those communications were taken out of context. We were simply trying to ensure that Mrs. Pemberton received due process before any accusations were made public. It's standard procedure to investigate complaints internally before involving outside authorities. Except that your internal investigation never happened. Detective Inspector Morrison replied coldly. Instead, staff members who raised concerns were transferred or terminated, and Mrs. Pemberton was allowed to continue caring for Prince Louis despite multiple warning signs. Marcus watched the exchange with fascination and growing satisfaction. For the first time since this ordeal began, he was seeing the palace establishment on the defensive, forced to answer for their failures rather than attacking his credibility. Chief Protection Officer Hartwell entered the room, looking haggard and defeated. Sir Christopher, I've just received word that Mrs. Blewett Pemberton has agreed to accept a plea bargain. She's willing to plead guilty to charges of child abuse in exchange for a reduced sentence. The news hit the room like a bombshell. Mrs. Pemberton's decision to accept a plea deal meant that there would be no lengthy trial, no opportunity for her legal team to challenge evidence or discredit witnesses. Most importantly, it meant that her guilt would be officially acknowledged, validating everything that Marcus had reported and Detective Inspector Morrison had investigated. Sir Christopher slumped slightly in his chair, recognizing that Mrs. Sirking Pemberton's plea deal would make it impossible to continue denying the reality of what had happened. The palace's strategy of discrediting the investigation and protecting their institutional reputation had collapsed entirely. Furthermore, Chief Protection Officer Hartwell continued reluctantly, "Mrs. Pemberton's attorney has indicated that she may be willing to provide information about other incidents and other staff members who were aware of her behavior in exchange for additional consideration from the Crown Prosecution Service." Detective Inspector Morrison smiled grimly. "In other words, she's prepared to implicate everyone who enabled her abuse of Prince Louis in order to reduce her own punishment. I would strongly advise anyone who might be mentioned in her testimony to seek legal counsel immediately." Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching the men who had tried to destroy his credibility and cover up child abuse finally face the consequences of their actions. But more importantly, he felt relief that Prince Louis would finally receive justice and that other children would be protected from similar abuse in the future. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same nursery where he had first discovered Prince Louis's injuries. The room had been completely redecorated, and a new nanny, carefully vetted through an exhaustive process that included psychological evaluation and extensive background checks, was helping the little prince with his afternoon snack. Prince Louis had healed remarkably well, both physically and emotionally. With the help of child psychologists specializing in trauma recovery, he had gradually regained his natural exuberance and joy. The fearful, withdrawn child Marcus remembered had been replaced by a normal 5-year-old who laughed easily and showed no signs of lasting psychological damage from his ordeal. "Mr. Marcus!" Prince Louis called out when he spotted him in the doorway. "Come see what I built with my blocks!" Marcus smiled and entered the room, kneeling down to examine an elaborate construction that appeared to be some kind of castle or fortress. The little boy's eyes were bright and happy, showing no trace of the fear that had haunted them during the darkest period of the investigation. "That's magnificent, Your Highness," Marcus said genuinely. "You're quite the architect." Princess Catherine appeared in the doorway, watching the interaction with a warmth that had been absent during the traumatic months of the investigation and trial. The stress and guilt that had marked her features during that period had faded, replaced by the natural glow of a mother who knew her children were safe and protected. "Mr. Thompson," she said, using the formal address that protocol required in front of staff, though her tone was anything but formal. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped into the adjoining sitting room, the same space where Dr. Hayes had first confirmed Marcus's suspicions about Prince Louis's injuries. The memories of that day seemed like they belonged to a different lifetime, though in reality only 6 months had passed. "I wanted you to know," Catherine said, "that Louis's therapist says he's made remarkable progress. She believes that your quick intervention prevented much more severe psychological trauma. If you hadn't spoken up when you did," she didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood what she was trying to say. Children who suffer prolonged abuse often carry those scars for the rest of their lives. By stopping Mrs. Pemberton's behavior when he did, Marcus had potentially saved Prince Louis from years of psychological damage. "I also wanted you to know," Catherine continued, "that William and I have been working with child protection advocates to reform palace hiring and oversight procedures. We've implemented mandatory training for all household staff on recognizing signs of abuse, established anonymous reporting mechanisms, and created regular psychological evaluations for all employees who work closely with the children." Marcus felt deeply satisfied to learn that some good had come from the traumatic experience. Prince Louis's suffering had led to systematic changes that would protect other children in similar positions of vulnerability. "Mrs. Pemberton received a 2-year prison sentence," Catherine added. "Sir Christopher and Chief Protection Officer Hartwell were forced to resign in disgrace, though they avoided criminal charges by cooperating with the prosecution. The entire experience has been a wake-up call for everyone involved in royal household management." Marcus nodded, remembering the media coverage of the trial. Despite the palace's best efforts to maintain privacy, news of the abuse case had eventually leaked to the press. However, the royal family's decision to pursue justice rather than cover up the scandal had actually improved their public image, demonstrating their commitment to protecting their children, even at the cost of negative publicity. From the nursery, they could hear Prince Louis's laughter as he played with his new nanny, under the watchful eye of additional security personnel. The sound was a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing, despite enormous pressure to remain silent, could lead to genuine healing and positive change. Marcus Thompson had faced down the full power of the British establishment and emerged victorious. More importantly, he had protected an innocent child from further harm and helped create a safer environment for all children in similar circumstances. In a world where too many people chose the easy path of silence and complicity, he had proven that one person's courage could make all the difference. The little prince was safe. Justice had been served, and the system had been reformed. Sometimes, not backing down was the only choice that mattered.